Hi, welcome to Daily Readings with Pastor Nate. Today we're on Matthew chapter 21, so if you haven't read it yet, please grab your favorite translation, pause this video, and read it now. If you'd like to read it online, I'll include a URL down in the description so that you can do that easily. So pause it now and we'll be back in just a minute. All right, Matthew 21. Jesus has a busy couple of days here. This is literally 2 days, and actually less than 2 days, I suppose, because by the end of the chapter, we don't have anything indicating it's moved on to another day. In fact, 22 looks like it picks up right where this left off. So this is about a day and a half worth of action, and boy, is there a lot going on here. So it begins with Jesus' triumphant entry into the city of Jerusalem. He's on his way to Jerusalem, which is a cause for some stress because they know that there are people in Jerusalem opposing him, and he's got his heart set on heading that direction. He sends some of his disciples ahead of him to get this donkey, this colt, and he rides it into the city, which is a fulfillment of a prophecy in Zechariah 9:9. Again, we see Matthew making sure to point that out because Matthew's very intentional about drawing these parallels between what Jesus is doing and what's been promised in the Old Testament or what's happened in the Old Testament. And this is a very particular prophecy because it talks about a king entering into the city. And so by riding in this particular manner, Jesus is identifying himself as a king. And it's interesting the way that Matthew quotes the passage because he actually leaves one line out. And to me, it seems like maybe the most important line in the verse. It says, your king comes to you full of righteousness and salvation, depending on your translation, something like that. And Matthew leaves out the part about righteousness and salvation and skips right to riding on the colt. And that seemed like a big deal, identifying Jesus as the righteous one, identifying him as the bringer of salvation. I suppose Matthew kind of assumes that people will recognize that. Maybe he's trying to draw attention to it by leaving it out. I don't know. But whatever the case, Jesus is very clearly sending a message here about being a king. And this particular prophecy talks about coming in peace. But it also talks about establishing a reign that goes from sea to sea. And so there was probably a kind of a mixed message here as he's riding into Jerusalem. People are getting this message, hey, this is a king, the king has arrived. But they also are getting this message that he's coming in peace, which seems strange because they're under Roman occupation. You can't become a king peacefully. So it may have caused a little bit of confusion, but clearly people understand the message that he's sending because this very large crowd gathers around him. And it's interesting that Matthew calls it a very large crowd. I think that should give us some perspective because if you remember back to the feeding of the 5,000, which Matthew says is 5,000 men besides women and children, so it's reasonable to think that that was 10,000, 12,000 people maybe, depending on how many wives and children and other women were present. And that's just a large crowd, according to Matthew's description. And here we have a very large crowd. So if 10 or 12 or 15,000 people in that first case is just a large crowd, a very large crowd must be enough bigger than that to merit the distinction. I don't know exactly how many people this is, but I think it's fair to think it could be 15, 20,000 people, which is an awful lot of people to have crowding the streets. Now, we're coming up on Passover, and people were starting to crowd into the city of Jerusalem. All faithful Jews were supposed to come to the city of Jerusalem for the Passover, and so the city is swollen up a bit already as it is, and now you have this enormous crowd that's kind of congregating on the edge of the city and working its way into the city and cheering and crying out, Hosanna in the highest, blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. And it was causing quite a commotion. But here you have Jesus riding in. He's being praised as the king, the son of David. He's being praised as the one who comes in the name of the Lord, the Messiah. And this huge crowd of people is cheering for this as he identifies himself as a king and rides into the capital. So when you read the whole city was stirred, that shouldn't come as a surprise. And in fact, it's really probably a bit of an understatement. The crowds were bigger than usual. The city was well above its normal population. People were probably a little bit on edge already just because of that swelling of the population. And now you have people hailing this king who's coming in. And meanwhile, there is a king who's been appointed by the Roman government to keep peace here and to rule over the people. And he can't be happy about this. And you have the Roman army who's stationed in Jerusalem seeing this, and they've got to be a little bit on edge about it. And this whole situation is just kind of causing some tension. And it's reminiscent actually of Matthew chapter 2, right? The Magi come and they say to Herod, we're here to worship this king. And it says, Herod was troubled and all Jerusalem with him. And now we see Jerusalem troubled again. In Greek, they're actually two separate words. The first one, they both kind of mean shaken up. And the first one is more like boiling water. And the second one, the one that's used here, is more like an earthquake. They were trembling. It's actually the word that they use at the crucifixion for the earth shook. All of Jerusalem was shook by what was happening. And as if that wasn't an eventful enough day, Jesus rides in and these crowds are cheering. He's on this donkey and he's being identified as the Messiah, as the king who's coming. And the first thing that he does is ride straight to the temple, which is a hugely symbolic act, and it's something that would not have gone unnoticed. And when he gets to the temple, it's not like he just takes it easy and does a little teaching. He gets to the temple and he drives out everybody who's buying and selling things there. He drives out the money changers who are exchanging the Roman currency for the money that they can use at the temple. He forces all those people out. He chases them out. And again, there's this identification with the Old Testament as he cites Jeremiah. And he says, my father's house is a house of prayer. But you've made it into a den of robbers. And so he cleans out the temple, and he doesn't just clean it out and disappear. He forces all these people out of the temple. He chases them away, and then he parks himself there. And from around the city, they begin to bring to him the blind and the lame, and he heals them. And he's not, he has all this attention, and here he is just sitting in the temple healing people. And the Pharisees come, and they're like, what are you doing? Like, why are you letting them praise you this way? And Jesus just kind of says, don't you know that God has ordained praises from the mouths of children? And he's citing Psalm 8, which is actually talking about praises to God. And here Jesus is self-identifying with it. So he stirs up about as much commotion as you possibly could in one day, rides into the city as a king, parks himself in the temple after chasing away all these people who were doing business there, and heals people, and then says, well, no, it's right for them to praise me this way. And then he leaves. He leaves the city and goes back to Bethany to spend the night there. But man, what a statement he's made in that entry. And the way that he's identified himself. So day 2 begins, and he comes back from Bethany into Jerusalem. And on the way, he sees this fig tree, and it's not bearing fruit. And so he curses it and says it's going to wither, and it withers right away. And the disciples ask him about it. And Matthew really focuses on the element of faith here, and kind of reiterates this idea that if we have faith the size of a mustard seed, we can ask a mountain to move, and it will. Or he says in this case, can we throw it in the sea, and it will. But there's something very symbolic about this interaction with the tree, right? It's a tree that's failing to bear fruit, and so Jesus curses it to wither. And I can't help but see some symbolism here with this old system, the sacrificial system, the old covenant system that has reached a point. Largely throughout its entire history, it's failed to bear very much fruit, but now especially it's failing to bear any fruit. And so by cursing this tree that's failing to bear fruit, in a way, Jesus is sort of symbolically cursing the system, the religious system that's in place in his time, and saying, look, it's not bearing any fruit, so I'm bringing it to an end. And very, very soon at this point, he is going to establish the new covenant by the shedding of his own blood. And so there's that symbolism there. After the fig tree, he moves into the city, and he has this encounter with the chief priests and the Pharisees, and they question him, by what authority are you doing this? And Jesus kind of turns the question back on them. He says, well, what authority was John using? And they refuse to answer because they know if they say it was heavenly authority, Jesus is going to call them out for not believing and following John. And if they say it was earthly authority, they're afraid that the people will turn on them because they all see John as a prophet. So they refuse to answer, and Jesus says, well, fine, I'm not going to answer your question either then. Which they probably weren't real excited about to begin with. And then Jesus goes on to tell these two parables. In the first parable, a father asks two sons to go do some work in the field, to go bear some fruit on his behalf. And the first son says no, but then goes out and does it. And the second son says yes, but then fails to do it. And the contrast here is kind of between the religious people, these very priests and Pharisees, who have made a verbal commitment, a very outward commitment, a very visible commitment to be about God's work, but are failing to actually do that, versus these other people, these outsiders, these non-religious people, the tax collectors and the prostitutes, who are coming through Christ to God. And that's this contrast that we have here. It's not about being religious. It's not about identifying yourself as religious or standing up and saying, I'm going to go do this. It's about actually doing it. And that's kind of the point of that first parable. And then the second one he tells is this parable of the tenants, where this father sets up a vineyard and hires people to come in and work it. And when he sends people to collect, they mishandle them. And then he sends his own son, and they kill the son so that they can try to steal the inheritance. And again, Jesus is speaking against these priests and these Pharisees, and kind of saying, listen, God has put you about his work, and you're failing to bear the fruit that you're supposed to. You're failing to yield up the harvest to him that he's supposed to receive. And so he sent these other people to call you out on it. And here he's talking about the prophets in that case. These prophets have come to try to get things working the right way, and you mistreated them. And a lot of the prophets were actually killed. And then the son himself comes, and they don't really understand completely that Jesus is talking about himself here, at least not the extent to which he means it literally. And he's predicting his own death here. You're going to kill me in order to try to steal the inheritance. They don't want to give up their power. They don't want to give up their position. And so they're going to execute Jesus in order to try to hold on to the benefits that they're gaining from the religious system. And obviously that Jesus is speaking against that very strongly. There's a warning there for us, right? Because as religious people today, in some cases, like in this story, we need to check ourselves, and the Pharisees might be the ones that we relate to most in this story. You know, we've made that verbal outward commitment, but are we actually following through with it? Or we've found ourselves in a position where we're receiving some kind of reward for our faith, whether it's good feelings or respect from other people, or sometimes positions of influence or power. Whatever it is that we're gaining, are we closed off to what Jesus is actually asking from us because we want to just hold on to the gains that we've chosen? Are we resistive to the times that God is reaching into our lives through other people, through his word, through whatever? Are we resisting? Are we mishandling those instead of allowing ourselves to be guided towards fruitfulness and to yielding the harvest that we should? So ask yourself those questions, meditate on that throughout the day. If this was a blessing, like it, subscribe, share it, whatever. If you have any questions or comments or feedback, please feel free to post it in the comments here or on the Facebook page. And I'm always open to constructive criticism, so if you have any, feel free to share it openly, or if you're more comfortable with a private message, you can do that too. And I'll see you tomorrow for Matthew chapter 22.